Today I am joined by Peter Hyatt, whose expertise is in statement analysis. Peter, can you just tell us, how did you become interested in statement analysis?
Quite a number of years ago, I was a self-described naive, very easy to deceive person. So I began reading books on statement analysis just as a hobby. Mm-hmm. But eventually, this led into employment where I was given initial 200 hours of training back in late 2001, I believe, in legally sound interviewing. And from there, I went into more formal training, worked on cases as a state investigator for allegations of child abuse and later on allegations of adult abuse. But then I went to teaching statement analysis, and after teaching it, it was very natural that those who attended would ask for assistance. And sometimes that assistance translated into, would you do the investigation for us, especially in private companies? From there, I became more and more involved with law enforcement, in training law enforcement, assisting law enforcement. And so currently I work full-time as an analyst and an instructor, teaching law enforcement, teaching journalists, lawyers, therapists, all different professionals who study the techniques used to discern deception, but also content analysis. So it goes well beyond just saying if someone is lying or not. What are they lying about? Why are they lying? Mm-hmm. Which leads to the ultimate is when someone sends an anonymous threatening letter. Statement analysis is often able to identify who wrote this letter and what the person that wrote the letter is like. Right. This allows them to know, is this threat real? The training involves testing, quizzes, practice, more tests, more quiz, more practice. Eventually, we offer certification, and this is also part of the University of Maine's continuing education units, we call it CEUs, for professional licenses. Mm-hmm. So people are involved in formal training are able to reach a level of certification. The certification is only worth what the work shows it to be. And in many detecting deception schools, they run around 70% success. For us, that would be an abysmal result. These investigators are running at or near 100% success rate.
Right. And you can test that by, you make an assertion during the investigation stage based on their statements, and then if someone is then convicted on other evidence, you know that you were correct. So that gives you a way of measuring the performance. Yeah.
That's one way of measuring. This is actually rather exciting. An easier way to measure the success is the confession.
Yeah. The
confession or admission, and we have that more than convictions, because when a person is deceptive, and during the interview process, where they are confronted using their own words, it is legally sound, it is non-interpretive, but where they're confronted with their own words, they often will either confess or admit what they have done. Now, the difference between a confession and admission is legally we need one or the other, but an admission is to acknowledge what one has done. A confession would say, what I've done is this, plus it's morally wrong. We don't need a confession, we do need an admission. Mm-hmm. Then we have something, it's called the A to Z. This is very exciting. An A to Z is where an investigator, say in law enforcement, receives a report of an allegation. Someone has stolen. And before any of the interviews or any of the investigation begins, the person who is accused of stealing is told to write out what happened. They are to sit down comfortably, choose their own words. They're given bottled water in a comfortable setting. There is no threats. There is no coercion. Please tell us in your own words what happened. And the person says, well, where do I begin? Wherever you feel comfortable beginning. So we don't introduce any language to them or any words. Person writes out what happened. If we then take that statement and properly analyze it in a scientific method, meaning we expect the same results, putting in the same data repeatedly, the investigator can now know this person did it, when he did it, how he did it, why he did it. So now a lengthy investigation has been shortened greatly. And A to Z is this, is the person is then interviewed based on their own words from that analysis. It's called analytical interviewing. No new language is introduced. The subject is not threatened at all. The subject is not interrupted. He is allowed to speak freely about what happened. When he reaches a point where he is caught by his own words, he often will admit what he did. Mm. When he admits what he has done, the investigator then takes the analysis, hands it to him, and says, review this for me. And there's often this type of unity between the investigator and the now suspect, where the suspect shares, oh, your analysis was correct here. Yeah, you're right. I did hide the gun there, and able to go through it. That investigator is now filled with resolve and confidence that he takes into other investigations. Mm-hmm. So it is fantastic traction for their careers. It's a strength for truth, and it becomes a lesson like no other.
The expression, giving someone enough rope to hang themselves, comes to mind.
That would be a good way of using it. They made their own rope with their own words. We didn't hand it to them in that sense. So it's legally sound.
Right. And obviously the police have the benefit of being able to put someone in that position and not force them to be questioned, but request them to do that. But certain cases that have been high profile in the media, we don't always get that. We don't always get the luxury to be able to put a subject in an interview type situation to write out their version of events. We go by snippets that have come out in the media, and we are going to come on to a case shortly. Can you recall what the first case you looked at was?
The first case that I worked for someone else, I've had success on my own, but the first case that I actually worked for someone else came after an instruction where there had been a theft. And local police had investigated the theft, but what they determined was that the company had too many employees that could have done it. Mm-hmm. And therefore they just closed it as unsolved. And the company had sent employees for training. And they asked if I could review their work, and then they eventually asked, could you take over for us? So I had all the employees write out what they did during their shift. I came back and said, here's the one that stole it, here's when he stole it, here's how he stole it. They asked if I would conduct the interview. I did, and he confessed.
Right, very good. And have you got a rough figure as to how many cases you've looked at?
Hundreds. It would be hard to tell, right, because it's most cases, I should say, at this point in my life, most cases I'm just assisting investigators. Mm-hmm. They're the ones doing the work. They're the ones that, and many of them are so good that they'll send me their analysis. That's an important thing. A good analyst never stands on his or her own footing. We always ask someone to check our work, always a second set of eyes, at least. Mm-hmm. And so we have many now in training that other law enforcement is asking them for help now because they're so good at it. Right. They're driven for justice.
And is your work ever used in court or by other professionals? Well,
it's used in court routinely. Statement analysis, like the polygraph, is not admissible as evidence. What happens is during even a cross-examination, the trained investigator is using statement analysis as he goes into testimony. So for instance, an example of this is a man who was accused of murder, took the stand in his own defense. And this is an example of how a prosecutor used the statement analysis to a successful conclusion. The man had been accused of killing a 13-year-old little girl out in the woods. He had claimed that he was alone in the woods. So, and when he took the stand in his own defense, the prosecutor asked, well, tell us what happened and what happened next. Those are the two most powerful questions that we have. What happened? What happened next? Mm-hmm. It allows them to choose whatever they want to choose. And this is an important point. The average person has a vocabulary of about 20,000 words. When you ask someone what happened, they must go into that vocabulary, decide what words to use out of the 20,000, where to order them, what verb tenses to use, what pronouns to use, where to place each word next to each other to communicate in less than a microsecond of time. That is a process that, when disrupted by deception, we catch. This man said he was alone. I was sitting down admiring the deciduous trees when we were losing daylight, so I got up, and the prosecutor said, "Excuse me, you said we were losing daylight?" The pronoun we is instinctive and intuitive. It meant he was not alone. The defense called for a recess. The next day they came back and attempted to explain away why the word we should mean I. The jury didn't buy it, and he was convicted.